Good morning, Angie. Uh, my name is Kati. I am a trauma-informed activist in Finland, dentist and therapist. And I was so happy to see that you are doing trauma-informed work in Africa. Could you tell us a little about your background?
Hi, my name is Angi Yoda-Maina, and I'm the Executive Director of the Green Street Network here in Nairobi, Kenya. Nice to meet you, Kati, and see you finally for the first time. Yeah. And my background is I'm a Kenyan American. I've lived in Kenya now for 15 years. 15 years and been married for about 20 to my Kenyan husband. I'm a peacebuilding practitioner, or always was, and now I talk about myself as a trauma-informed practitioner or healing-centered practitioner with peacebuilding as one of our larger underlying fundamental goals.
Interesting. In what area is this Green String or network operating?
So Green String Network, we're a fairly young organization. We're only about 3.5 years old. And as long-term peace builders who've worked all over the African continent, and I've worked actually in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, as well as in the US, where I was a volunteer before I ever left the US in very violent neighborhoods, we started to realize that everyone we met in our work as peace builders had a history of trauma and were acting out in very negative, responsive ways to their trauma, and you can never get to peace building. So it was something that we started to realize that we needed to start to do healing, we needed social healing, we needed these as foundational pieces to any peace building work that we wanted to do. So about 12 years ago, we were running a peace building program. There was a violent conflict that started, and actually one of our participants was killed in crossfire as he was driving back home towards the border of the Kenyan, Ethiopian, Somali border. And we said, look, we're a peace building organization, we should do something. And when we called the government official and said, we want to come and help get engaged, he said, no, this is security, stay out, NGOs aren't welcome. And then we sat down, my two colleagues, two very famous peace building colleagues from Kenya, Deka Abdi Ibrahim and Tekla Wanjala Namachanja. Both of them had a history of looking at trauma healing within peace building. So we called him and said, hey, Mr. Dio, can we come and do trauma healing? And he said, yeah, and can you stop by my office? I think I need some. And so it just started us along a process where we began to eventually make this a foundational piece of our peace building program, of any development programs we were doing, and even governance programs. It became something that was very much the first step to other things that were maybe our end goal. And so in conflict, violent zones, we find people are really in distress and they can't do peace. They can't build governance. They can't even do development because they're so much caught in the past and they're acting out of their fight, flight, flee, freeze mode. And so we've just really realized later on that the more global trauma-informed movement really fits so well with how we had actually been building something very organically based on the communities that we had met. And so that's where we really now started to use the language of trauma-informed, healing-centered, as we got to know the more global community from North America and Northern Europe and Australia, who were working in really similar violent communities and wanting to say we need to do something different. And most of those folks were coming more from psychology, social work, but we found that our multidisciplinary approach as peace builders fit very well with all of them. So that's kind of where we are. We've developed a very unique kind of rich African indigenous methodology where we use images and paintings and do storytelling.
Okay.
But what we've really been able to do is develop a peer support network.
Okay. Yeah.
There are quite a few psychologists and psychiatrists, less psychiatrists in Kenya nowadays, but psychologists are more and more. But nobody can afford them.
Yeah.
Culturally, who wants to say, I'm ill, I'm sick, something's wrong with me in my head? That's kind of where people go. And what we realized is there are already people who are points of resilience in communities.
Yeah.
And if you can tap into them and teach them some of the brain science,
Yeah.
they're already building resilience because they're the people who get knocked on the door. Help support them, teach them some of the new stuff about nervous system alignment.
Yeah.
And yet sometimes they're teaching us more from indigenous practices of what really fit within these newer kind of models that are there. And so we're emerging them.
Yeah, and that's so interesting when you yourself learn all the time new things from people, and so it's really interesting work. I think this trauma informed. And do you how have you created your own model? You have on your web page your model. I could open it. You could tell more about this model.
Sure, you can open it.
Yeah. Let's see
the approach, maybe.
Approach, yes. Yeah, here.
Yeah, so we're calling this a healing-centered peace-building approach. Don't know, it's not fitting so nicely on your screen, but you'll see in the center, you'll see that we're dealing with issues of chronic violence. And I think many folks will realize that a lot of people who come to you with depression, anxiety, even some of the other bipolar, schizophrenic, you'll start to look into their deeper history, and you'll realize there's a lot of perhaps the adverse childhood experiences, adverse community environments that they grew up in, and a lot of it is tied into violence and their history with violence. And I started to put this together actually for my PhD, but I look at this in terms of how Tani Adams talked about chronic violence, and she talked about it as very complex. It's not kind of the good and the bad, but it's many shades of gray in between there. And that innocent civilians and, brutal perpetrators are oftentimes much more closer to each other than they are at dual ends of the spectrum. And that the complexity in that violence means that it's not perpetrators versus victims. That oftentimes victims in the cycle of violence become the new perpetrators and create new victims. And that this process, which is very much part of the peace building world, has actually now is how I've looked at how it looks. And when I looked at the more mental health approach, particularly as it's used in places like Kenya, and other places. This is where I have 20 years of experience. I don't really work in North America or in Northern Europe anymore. The mental health approach is not working to address chronic violence.
Yes.
And it's really a patient, it's very Western, it's about protocols, it's evidence-based, which is very good, but it doesn't actually deal with chronic violence. And then the psychosocial programming approach, and in many ways, for years, a lot of the work we were developing, many of us thought, okay, maybe we're psychosocial because we didn't have another name, another space to put ourselves in. And at that point, we started to realize again, this is about victims and survivors. The perpetrators are never a part of a psychosocial approach. while it's a good Band-Aid, and Band-Aids are needed in emergencies, it doesn't carry on into the long-term sustainability piece that's actually needed if you're going to build good governance, if you're going to really take post-conflict countries into a new place. So, and it doesn't actually deal with governance, and it's a good connecting people socially, but it doesn't, again, deal with chronic violence. So we started to say, well, we deal with chronic violence in the work that we're doing. And I started to find the trauma-informed community deals with issues of chronic violence and injustice. And so as I started to look, we decided we needed a new approach. And we call this the healing-centered approach. We're a trauma-organized society that needs trauma-informed approaches to become healing-centered. So our end goal is around healing. The trauma-informed approaches get us there. You'll see up in that right-hand corner, the ignore it. So there's quite a few people who actually ignore that chronic violence in post-conflict or in conflict states is actually something that they should even be looking at, because they feel like the conflict is done, let everybody get on with it. Let's just build some buildings. But what we've seen from Afghanistan to Iraq to Somalia to South Sudan to even the Balkans, building and rebuilding, if you don't actually deal with the underlying issues of chronic violence and lack of the injustice and start a healing process, these things look nice in the short term, but in the long term, they crumble. They become the new sources of continued violence. So the healing-centered approach, I've kind of looked at it in 5 different ways. I'm going to, sorry, there's someone coming in. So I've looked at it in 5 different ways. It's really small on here. I've looked at it as ways of looking at inclusion, contextualization, and making it very culturally appropriate. Kind of in the center is, how do we break these cycles of violence? The systems approach, I think, is there. Can you go down just a little bit? And then the 5th one, is bringing in the trauma-informed approaches. So embodiment, connection, safety and security, brain science, all of these different things. So those different pieces make up what I say is a body of work that globally is already happening. It just didn't have a name. And oftentimes it was being called psychosocial approaches, but it went beyond what I think psychosocial approaches really are, and how they're really being used on the ground in places where I've been working for the last 20 years.
And you have been working outside of Kenya too, in Somalia and Ethiopia, or?
Somalia, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Sierra Leone, a little bit in Tanzania, and then also in the Balkans.
Yeah.
Kosovo.
Neurobiological basis is same in all the trauma-informed views, I think. So, and it's very interesting, because I think that all you talk about, it goes to Finnish system too. So this is a kind of universal language, I think, this trauma-informed care.
Yeah, I think it is becoming more universal. I think it's starting to make sense. And I would say that before COVID, climate change was taking us there to be more aware of global distress. But now with COVID, we have an example of real global distress where we're all a part of it.
Yeah.
And we're starting to have a similar experience about, you know, the fight and the flight, freeze, all these different responses. And people are starting to recognize them more if you start to talk about them, because COVID has made it almost now a universal response to be nervous. So today, everybody washing their hands every 30 minutes is normal, where 3 months ago, that was a OCD habit. And everybody is feeling the stress and the depression, and they're starting to feel the economic issues. And so the nervousness and anxiety that we're all facing, I think, starts to get us to understand more that we need, really a collective response to this that isn't the individual diagnosable DSM system that I don't think actually really works for people, and that it's not what is wrong with you, but really what has happened to you. And I think COVID is starting to give us a space to talk about that in a more kind of realistic terms for people who before thought, oh, I don't need to listen to that because I'm okay.
Yeah, I totally agree. And would you tell us what kind of results have you gotten from your work?
So actually on our website, you'd be able to find a really kind of deep impact report that we put together and released last October.
Okay.
Last November. But what we found is when we put a healing process as a foundational piece, people start to collectively have more agency. They start to work together to deal with the issues that impact them all. We've seen the healing process bring down levels of depression, anxiety, all of the different things that would show high on kind of a PTSD scale. We're showing that I think 9 out of the 16 kind of markers for distress have been seen to reduce. We're seeing that people are becoming who they really want to be and not stuck and isolated and feeling bitter and angry. And that makes better citizens, that makes better people who can engage to do things that help them and their community in ways that without this kind of a healing process, really just won't happen, because an NGO or a psychologist comes into a community to say, well, let me start to do some workshops with you and we make some change. It has to come from deep within people.
Yeah.
And it has to come from their own stories and their own experiences. So lived experience becomes one of the driving factors for us.
I see that same enthusiasm here in Finland. People, like this pandemic, it kind of stops people to think more. And I think there is a universal willing to change at the moment.
Yes.
So I do hope that we will get globally a new culture and where we are caring more about other people and not just ourselves.
That would be a good thing to come out of this. I think
I would like to know a little bit, what is the COVID situation there at your area at the moment?
So Nairobi has been in lockdown now, I think, for over 40 days. We can't leave the Nairobi larger metropolitan area. You can click there and go to the Kiswahili, just there on the top. People have lost a lot of jobs. Businesses have been closed. Restaurants have just reopened, but they're not really reopening. Up here on the top, you'll find Kiswahili English. Just click there. And for the most part, Kiswahili English on the black bit after home. After the home page, you can click to Kiswahili.
Oh,
English.
there, yeah.
And so right now, people are really under and non-employed. In the informal settlements, hunger has really started. And so one of the things that we've started to do is create images and pictures like this one you see here that start to show people what does it mean to live with COVID in a safe way. So what does physical distancing look like in Kenya, in a place where we're always crowded on each other? There's no personal space. It's very different than Finland, I think.
Yeah, it is.
And and so what does it mean to look like to carry a mask? And you can keep going down. There's many different pictures. So now I think we have about 15 or 20 images that start to show, for example, the police we want. So COVID has very much become securitized. Our curfew from 7 p.m. at night has been something that the police have had to enforce. The masks are something the police have to enforce. And what we're trying to say, if it's about enforcement, then we're not able to really do this work. We have to get it community-led. And so we have things on hand washing, how to sit in a public transportation with space, how to do physical distancing, walking in the village, what it means to get home for curfew, we're looking at how do you stand in a water point before it was very crowded, how do we give physical distancing, like we said, how to wear a mask, to make masks. So we've got a little project here where we're making masks.
Yeah.
And you can see here, this is one that we've now, I think we have 5 or 6 women tailors who are being trained this week on how to make a mask. And they'll start to earn a small livelihood, and we'll be able to give whole families from children over 2, for the whole family, 2 masks. And then we'll give them information like this poster of how to wear a mask, why you're wearing a mask, how to clean a cloth mask, and more importantly, how to live with it, to stop sharing it and things like that. So those are some of the things that right now we're doing because it's an emergency. Our community spread in Nairobi is really starting to increase. And people still are not fully seeing that this is something that could really overload us because we've kept the cases, because of the measurements that the government has taken, so low. But on the other hand, if it does take off like it has in our neighboring country of Tanzania, where now they're saying there's, 20,000 cases and thousands of deaths, we would really be overrun in our in our health system. And our health system regionally is much better than a place like Mogadishu in Somalia or in South Sudan. And I fear that both of those places, it's actually starting to grow there. So all of us are impacted both economically, socially, but also the health issues, while here in Kenya are still okay, we're still at a point where things could go bad.
Thank you so much, Angie. A lot of information, and you are doing really great work there. I wish we had as good web pages. You have so much information.
Thank you. We spent a lot of time with our web page because in many ways we wanted to show what trauma-informed looked like in practice.
Yeah.
People to see what it really looks like here in our context.
Yeah.
And not just out there in places where it seems unreal. And we feel like more and more we're starting to really make it very real and very contextualized. And so it's not something that's from outside, it's something that we own.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. And I hope we will meet again. This has been so interesting.
Thank you so much. And we will continue to meet. Thank you so much, Kati.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.